So this season, we are talking about what it means to be Christian. Because there's a lot of people that call themselves Christian. And so if we would say to somebody that we are Christian, they might just ask us what we mean. It's not a given anymore. And yes, the easy answer is we follow Christ. We follow Jesus Christ. But they're going to want to know a lot more than that. And so we've been using this season to try to tease out some of the other pieces of what it means to be Christian. And today, one of the theme is we are Christian because we learn about God's love. And so I want you to think during this sermon, during this time, about who taught you about God's love. How did you first learn about God's love? Or who were the people in your life, because it might have been more than one, who helped you to know more, to feel more of God's love for you, that really helped you on your journey of faith? So that's something for you to sit with as we look at this scripture. Our scripture today was probably familiar to you. It is the I am the good shepherd. It comes around every 3 years in the lectionary, and it's one of the 7 I am statements of Jesus that we often do as a series. It's a scripture that brings us a lot of comfort to know that Jesus is the one leading our lives, that Jesus is the one who will rescue us, who will care for us, who will protect us, who will guide us if we're paying attention. There is that little caveat there. And it has this particular verse in it, which is kind of interesting. I also have other sheep that do not belong to this fold. It's not clear what Jesus meant with this phrase, or what was meant by this. Traditionally, scholars have said, well, that was the non-Jewish people, Gentile people, us. We are the other, maybe that is part of the fold. But the beauty of the scripture is that it's not clear. And so we cannot make a determination of who is the other. It's not for us to judge. We believe in a God who is all merciful and all powerful, and therefore only Jesus knows who else is in the flock. There is a part of this scripture, though, that breaks down for people, and that is when we tell people that Jesus is the good shepherd who protects them, and then something goes wrong. They're like, where was Jesus? We don't have a good answer for that. But people do make choices. We do have agency in our life. And we do make choices, and sometimes those choices hurt others or hurt ourselves. As we go through this scripture today, I also want you to think about which character are you? We've got 3 characters, and I'm going to go through them. So the first character in the parable is the sheep. My guess is that you have been told on more than one occasion when listening to a sermon on this that you are the sheep. That's the traditional read of this, that we are the sheep. And I gave you this really cute sheep face so you could feel all sentimental about being a sheep. But then I usually talk to you about how dumb sheep are. Okay? how they but more that they will eat, they will just eat until there's dirt. They don't know how to say no to themselves. They don't know how to regulate themselves. But they're also completely self-absorbed. They're unaware of anything else in their environment. And that's how sheep get into trouble. Because they say, oh, this piece of grass is really good, and this piece of grass is really good, and this piece of grass, oh, that looks good over there. I'll go eat that piece of grass, and I'll go eat this. And they'd walk right off a cliff because they don't know there's a cliff there. Or they don't know that they've left the flock because they're not looking at anybody else. So it is a good reminder for us to think of ourselves as the sheep. And how often do we say, this is all too much for me, so I'm just going to put my head down and I'm going to do this thing today, and then this thing, and then this thing, and I'm going to ignore everything else that's happening around me. And that's really easy to do right now. Because we don't want to see the news. We don't want to hear that there's been another shooting, that there's been 2 shootings in 24 hours. That breaks our hearts. We don't want to think about that. We just want to put our heads down and, okay, I'm going to eat breakfast, and then I'll go, so y'all came to church. And then you're going to go home and eat lunch and maybe take a nap, and then maybe you're going to eat dinner and ignore the rest of this mess out here. But the reality is, we aren't sheep. We have agency. And we need to wake up. We need to pick our heads up and pay attention to what's happening around us. Because it's time to start naming some of the things that are happening that are wrong, that are not in line with Jesus' love and compassion and mercy. We need to wake up. Did you ever think about whether you were the hired hand of the story? My guess is not. The argument could certainly be made that Jonathan and I are hired hands. The clergy, the paid clergy are the hired hands who are paid to care for the sheep. Well, there's a lot there. There's a lot of stories, plenty of stories of hired hands, clergy who have acted inappropriately, who have not cared for the sheep, who have taken their paycheck and not cared for the sheep, or have used their power and their authority to take advantage of sheep that were children, youth, or even adults inappropriately. And that's a reality. And we have to call those hired hands on that. But I wonder if some of us aren't hired hands too. Maybe you don't get a paycheck, but maybe you've been part of a congregation because that was where you got power or influence. It is the history of the church that the church survived for many years because women who were not allowed to work outside the home were allowed to have power in the church. And that built the church. It's one of the reasons we struggle now, because now our young women do work. They do have other places where they get power and they get fed, and they have the ability to share their gifts and talents in other places than the church. Some of that's not necessarily a bad thing. A lot of it was to our good, but there were some who took advantage of that, male and female. And there's also those who are our brothers and sisters who view their life as, and their call to convert people to Christianity, to get jewels in their crown. That comes out of Revelations, that for every person you convert, you get a jewel in your crown. And they're just accumulating jewels. And if you're accumulating jewels, then you're working for your own purposes and you're not working for God. As I know clergy, we have clergy brethren particularly who can tell you they have a running count of how many people they converted. And that they have bragging rights for that. They take bragging rights for that. I don't think that's what it's about either. I think it's about showing love. You're going to hear this again and again and again. Love, compassion, forgiveness, mercy. Right? That's what Jesus practiced. In fact, with the disciples, there's plenty of stories where the disciples thought it was about them. The whole thing about who's going to be first. And Jesus says it's not about who's first, it's about who's last. It's not about being at my right or my left. It's not about you, and it's not about the power you're going to have by being Christian. It's about living a life that models Christ's life, that models the way he reached out to people, cared about people, nurtured people, brought people together, built community where they could care for one another. Have you ever thought of yourself as the shepherd? And the quick answer to this is, oh no, I'm not the shepherd. That's Jesus' job. Yes, Jesus is the good shepherd. Jesus is the shepherd of all shepherds. But I think we have a role of shepherding. If you go back to that first question I asked you, who helped you to learn about the love of Jesus in your life? Whoever that was a shepherd to you. They were shepherding you in faith. They were helping you to learn what this faith was about, what it meant to be Christian and follow Jesus. That there's more to it than just what we get out of it. It's like worship. Why do you come to worship? Because worship isn't about us. Worship is about God. Worship is about what we do to talk to God and thank God. Our worship should be about praise and gratitude. We can cry out to God too with our concerns and the things that pain us. But it's about God. It's not about us. Even though a lot of us feel better afterwards, that's a byproduct. And that's good. God's happy for us to go out and feel rejuvenated and refocused on being more Christ-like. But that's not the point of worship. So I wonder what God thinks of our worship. Does God look at our worship and think, wow, that's really praise? Or that's ambivalence? Is that sincerity, or mediocrity? How do we approach our worship of God? I think that matters. When I go to prepare a sermon, I pay attention all week to what comes in, what comes past me. What do I hear? And especially specific pieces that jump out to me. And I heard a quote by Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel this week. This is the longer quote, and I think it's worth reading. We must believe that morally speaking, there is no limit to the concern one must feel for the suffering of human beings. That indifference to evil is worse than evil itself. And this is the quote I had actually heard, that in a free society, some are guilty, but all are responsible. Everyone has a responsibility for what happens. So when we see things, when we see people who are acting out of arrogance or meanness or rudeness, we need to stand up and say, that's wrong. That's unacceptable. That's not following Jesus. That's not how Jesus acted. Even if we can disagree with someone, we don't have to be disagreeable. When we see people, we have to wake up and pay attention to the people around us. When we see somebody acting differently, changing their routine, we need to name that, to ask them if they are all right. Because maybe if that had happened with the two shooters before they got to that point, maybe we could have intervened. Maybe there were some mental health professionals could have been involved and could have prevented that. We have to stop doing everything reactively. We need to get on the other end of this. We can't allow the general discourse to be fear-mongering. We can't allow this to continue to be that we need to be afraid. We have to start taking agency, because we have agency, and we have love, and we have compassion. And we have to say that the other is wrong. We can't stay silent, or we're part of the problem. The verse before our scripture lesson for today, John 10:10, Jesus says, I came that they may have life and may have it abundantly. We are meant to have abundant life. We are meant to have abundant joy in our life. That's what we need to work towards. Not just for us, everybody. Everybody has that right. Everybody is invited into that world. So let's wake up. Let's pick up our noses from eating the grass and pay attention to what's happening around us. And name when we see something that's wrong. May it be so. Amen.